It's time for the Douglas Coleman Show. Mr. Smooth and Savvy is joined by guests from all walks of life, from the entertainment industry to authors to political and social commentators, the famous and not so famous, the controversial and the light and fluffy. We have it all. Now, here's Douglas Coleman.
Okay, please welcome back for his third appearance on the Douglas Coleman Show, Shostak. Yeah, I was going to say that right.
I'm going to change my name to that because you're not the only one that does. Lucille Ball did that.
Did she really?
She'd answer the phone and I'd say, "Hi, Lucy," and she'd go, "Oh, hi, Stu."
It is a bit of a tongue twister. All right, let me just...
Stu Shostak.
Yeah. Let me try it again. Okay, back for his third appearance on the Douglas Coleman Show. Please welcome Stu Shostak. Hi, Stu. How are you?
I've been called worse. Hello, Douglas. How you been?
Good. You know, I was just thinking about that word, too. Is it an appearance if you're on a radio show?
That's... You want to ponder that for the whole hour? I guess
not really, no, but I just was, because you say, well, appearance, but you're not being seen, you're only being heard. But does just audio only count as an appearance? I mean, what else, what other word would I use?
Well, let's see. What would be a synonym for appearance in the audio sense? A hearing? Well, no, that's something else.
No, that's something else. Well, all right, we'll just go with appearance. But I can't think of another one. Anyways, glad to have you back, and I know we had to postpone, and I apologize for that, but at that time, I was going to ask you a little bit more about Dick Van Dyke, because we got into that in the last show that you were on, but we really didn't touch on him too much, and at the time, you were getting ready to go to his Halloween party, which I wanted to hear about since now it's passed. But you said that he does some big Halloween party every year?
Yeah, Halloween is his favorite holiday. And I've also, since I was last with you, went to his 97th birthday gathering at his house. It wasn't really a party because there was only about 10 of us. But we could talk about that too if you want. Halloween has always been a big deal for Mr. Van Dyke, dating back to the days when he first moved out here from New York and first lived in the Palisades and then moved to Encino. He loves monsters, real life-size monsters. He loves goblins and witches, and he just is fascinated by the whole holiday. And I never did ask him, but I'll bet it stems back to his childhood. I'll bet Halloween was a really big deal for him and his brother Jerry when they were growing up in Danville, Illinois. That's something I will ask him and get back to you on, though, to see the origin of this whole thing. But he spends a lot of money, and we all spend a lot of time setting up animatronic figures alongside his house and in his backyard, and we hang a lot of spooky stuff, and there's bats flying, and
wow.
And it's quite an event, and it's open to the public. The street side of it is anyway. And each year we put on a stage show in front of his garage with lights and cameras and microphones. And the last few years I've been lucky enough to MC those shows and bring on the acts. And his wife loves to dance and get dressed up, and usually the grand finale, Dick will come out and they will do a number together. So it's a 15 or 20-minute show that I'm absolutely honored to MC, and they let me ham it up, and they let me pretty much do whatever I want to do, kind of like my old audience warm-up days. And it's a feeling when you get praised lavished upon you by Dick Van Dyke. That really means something. When you're told that you're the best ad-libber since Maury Amsterdam.
Oh, that's a compliment.
Coming from him,
oh, yeah.
That is an amazing compliment.
Oh, absolutely. So this show, he's doing this in front of his house, or how does this work? You said it was public.
Yeah. The animatronic figures and the smoke and the mirrors and the monsters and all of this stuff is set up alongside his house in Malibu. It's in a private gated community, and so he has to have it cleared with the security there. That so not the public is invited, but they have to know about it. And most of the people in Malibu, he's the honorary mayor of Malibu, or he was. So everybody in the local area there knows that this happens every year. And Malibu is a town where he can walk around and not get accosted too much by tourists. Or because it's so out of the way. Every once in a while there'll be somebody there from TMZ with a camera and a microphone, because those idiots are everywhere. But outside of that, he can pretty much go. Like, I've gone to Ralph's Market with him there, and people leave him alone. I mean, they say hello, Mr. Van Dyke, but they don't clamor for his autograph or anything like that. So my point being that the townspeople there know that this happens, and they come and they bring their kids. And for the most part, they're very respectful and very appreciative. And the fact that he just turned 97 and he's still doing this is quite an accomplishment.
Oh, well, that's amazing.
But the short answer to my long response is that they rent a stage, a full-fledged stage, and they set it up in front of his driveway, and they rent lights that are set up across the street and beam down at the stage, and they get an audio engineer with a mixer so that we're all mic'd, and the audience sits right in front of the stage. It's mostly kids, and the adults stand in the street behind the kids. And I give away candy and stuff, and I get them up on stage and play games with them, and in between the acts. And we have ventriloquists, we have puppets, we have dancing. It's like a massive birthday party. If you were a spoiled rich kid in Malibu and your parents hired the very best talent, with the exception of me, of course, to be a part of this party, it's like that, except that a couple of hundred people watch us. There's so many people that enjoy it. That we do two shows. We do a 6:30 show, and then we do a 7:30 show. One year we had to do an 8:30 show because there were so many people. But when the pandemic hit, it stopped us from doing any kind of stage show for a year or so. We had drive-bys, and I mean that in the most positive way. You could drive by and see the monsters and all of that. Because if you say drive-by in the LA area, it means something different. But this was the first year. No, did we? No, I think last year was the first year. We made everybody mask up. But we did the show last year. We didn't have a huge turnout last year because people were still afraid of the pandemic. I'm talking 2021, but 2022, we had excess crowds. We almost had to do a third show, but it got to be too late. Mr. Van Dyke did not take part in this show this year, but he did last year. He was off to the side watching and critiquing us, and fortunately I got complimented again. So
oh, great.
That's all I care about, Douglas. I don't care about the other acts. I just want Mr. Van Dyke to be happy with what I do.
Is any of this recorded or live streamed? Or
yeah, but we hire a videographer specifically for us. But when I was out there introducing acts, the cell phones were going wildly. People, we don't restrict anybody from recording it. And one of these days, the videographers will edit these shows together so that they look good, and we'll put them online. But on Facebook, if you go to Dick Van Dyke's public page on Facebook, anybody can go to that and scroll down far enough, you might see a few clips.
Oh, okay. So, yeah, because I think people would like to see that. It sounds
absolutely.
amazing. Yeah.
The man is amazing. He's 97 years old, and he still drives, and he walks without a cane, and he remembers everything. And that is due to his wife taking such good care of him and his working out every day. He's got a little gym in his backyard, but he has another gym that he goes to in Malibu 3 or 4 times a week at 7 in the morning. And he lifts weights, and he gets on a stationary bike. And his last book was called Keep Moving. And that's the secret. At 97, if he didn't have that beard, if he shaved that beard, he would look, 20 years younger. And I've kidded him about that. I said, Dick, I know you hate to shave, and I know you like having the beard, but if you shave it, you'll look 20 years younger. And he says to me, so I'll look 77 instead of 97. Is that what you're telling me? So,
Well, it's amazing.
I'm glad he's alive. He's a national treasure. He's a legend. He's an icon. And the fact that I am privileged and lucky enough to be friends with him and his wife and was invited to his small gathering for his birthday, that means more to me than anything in the world right now.
Well, what's amazing, the fact that he's 97 is amazing in itself, but also that he was very public about his alcoholism back in the day. And
Yes.
so obviously when he was younger, he did not take care of himself as well as he probably should have. And sometimes that takes a toll on people where, they do permanent damage to their body. But thank God with him.
Why do you think all these rock stars that we loved in the 60s are all dropping dead in their early 70s now?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. It's because.
Very good point.
Yeah.
That's a very good point. And I'm at the age right now where if I have a cough, I call my doctor. I take no chances. I drive my doctor nuts, but he doesn't mind. He says, that's what I'm here for. And I've had this doctor since 2003. And so I was in my early 40s, mid 40s when I started going. I'm 66 now. So yeah, I was in my mid 40s. And the secret is the slightest thing you have, take care of it right away. To your point to Dick, though, yeah, I mean, he was a very heavy drinker and a very heavy smoker. And around 1982, he gave both of them up. I think he gave up the alcoholism a few years prior to that. He doesn't miss it. He chews a lot of nicotine gum, a lot.
Okay.
But, he is in amazing health, and he's had his share of bad things happen in his life too. He's had relatives die on him, grandkids getting sick and dying, and his brother died a few years ago. So he's had his share of misery and downers, yet his attitude and his health are just incredible. He should easily make it to 100, easily. And he's got 3 years for that. So he's still got a ways to go.
Did him and Mary Tyler Moore stay friends
yes.
after the show?
Oh, yes. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And when Mary's health started failing and the tabloid magazines and the online people like TMZ started to exploit that, he was furious with them. Absolutely furious, calling it crap and, terrible. And she was practically blind by the time she died. She had diabetes back in the day they were shooting the series, but she was young then and it was controllable. But she was a smoker. She tried to quit several times, at least during the series. I don't know if she eventually quit. I think she eventually had to, but I don't know at what age. But, oh, yeah, he was friends with everybody, especially Carl Reiner, right up until the day he died. And he was very, very upset about that. He constantly says, Stu, I have no friends my own age anymore. They're all gone. And one of the reasons I think he and I get along so well is because being a historian and knowing his career so much, he can talk to me about stuff that happened back on Bye Bye Birdie and in days prior to the Van Dyke Show. And because I've studied, his career and because I'm his archivist now, the way I was Lucille Ball's, and I come across stuff, he can talk to me as if I was his age. And he really, really likes having somebody, when he says the name, for example, you'll know this, but I don't know how many of your audience will. He'll mention a character actor like Ned Glass, okay? And I'll know exactly who he's talking about, and I'll know stuff that he did, and I'll know the Van Dyke Show episodes that he was in. People like that, and Herbie Faye, and Charles Lane, and Dabbs Greer, and Parley Bear, Lyle Talbot. These are people that anybody half our age would never know who they are. But he can talk to me, and he'll tell me stories about them, and I'll know exactly, how these things went down. And, there's other people his age, like Norman Lear is 100, Mel Brooks is 96 now, I think, and he knows them, but he's not close to them like he was with Carl. Carl and he chatted 4 or 5 times a week. Carl came over to Dick's house a lot. Dick was over at Carl's house a lot. Carl's pretty much responsible for Dick's career, and that was a huge loss for him when Carl passed a couple of years ago.
Dick Van Dyke was already famous when the show started with Mary Tyler Moore. I mean, he had done Mary Poppins, right?
No, he hadn't.
Oh,
Mary
he hadn't.
Poppins happened during the Van Dyke Show.
Oh,
Dick was not
okay.
Dick was a famous Broadway star when the Van Dyke Show started. Bye Bye Birdie had pretty much made him a Broadway star, but you know as well as I do, if I said the name Sutton Foster to you, most people wouldn't know who that was, but she's one of the biggest stars on Broadway right now. If you said that to somebody in New York, they would know. Dick Van Dyke was a big Broadway star, even though he would never admit it. He's very humble and non-egotistical, but he was well known to New York audiences then, but he was not a national figure until the Dick Van Dyke Show came along.
Oh, okay. So I didn't know that he did Mary Poppins. So he did that during the show?
Yes,
while
it
he
was
doing-
between
yeah.
the second and third season of the Van Dyke Show. When they wrapped in March of 1963 on the second season of the Van Dyke Show, he went right to work on Mary Poppins and worked on that all during the hiatus. And that came out during the fourth year of the Dick Van Dyke Show.
Oh, interesting.
So, and he did Bye Bye Birdie between the movie version, between the first and second season of the Van Dyke Show.
Okay.
So, and as you recall, the Van Dyke Show was not a hit in its first season. Sheldon Leonard had to beg Procter & Gamble to give it another season. In those days, the sponsors controlled the time periods on the network. That went away toward the late 60s, early 70s when the network started to get their own sales department and were selling time to whoever wanted it. They wanted more control of the time slots. But in the early 60s and the 50s, the networks controlled the time slot, and Procter & Gamble dropped their sponsorship of the show after the first season because the ratings were bad. And Sheldon went back to Cincinnati and begged the head of Procter & Gamble to pick up the show and give them one more chance, which they did, but they didn't sponsor the whole show. They only sponsored half of it, so they had to get another sponsor, which ended up being Kent Cigarettes. And so one week Kent sponsored the show, and the other week Procter & Gamble did. And then CBS had the brilliant idea of putting the show on after the Beverly Hillbillies on Wednesday nights. And the Beverly Hillbillies was what really made the Van Dyke Show a hit, because the Beverly Hillbillies was an instant hit the second it went on the air. And the Van Dyke Show followed it. And in those days, before remote controls, people were too lazy to get up and change the channel. So here's what's interesting about that, Douglas, is you've seen the Beverly Hillbillies, the most non-sophisticated, silly, stupid, ridiculous program on the air at the time. And boy, it got lambasted by critics like crazy in those days, until Gilligan's Island came on a couple of years later and debunked it as the stupidest show on the air. But despite the fact that the critics hated the show, audiences loved it. It was the number one show between that and the Lucy Show, which also came on that year. They were the number one and the number two shows. They seesawed back and forth. And as a result of that, with the Dick Van Dyke Show following it got propelled into the top 10 as well, as did the Andy Griffith Show, because it followed the Lucy Show on, it followed the Danny Thomas Show, which followed the Lucy Show on Monday nights. And CBS was a force to be reckoned with back in those days. They had all the hit sitcoms. So thanks to Sheldon convincing Procter & Gamble to keep the sponsorship going, and CBS putting it on after the Beverly Hillbillies, that's what made Dick Van Dyke a star. Now, that's a very long answer to your short question, but that's what happened.
So how many seasons did the Dick Van Dyke Show run?
It ran 5. It was always going to be a 5-season show. There was no turning back. Carl wanted to move on. He felt all sitcoms got stale after 5 years. That's not always the case, but it was still a good move on their part, because the 5th season of the Van Dyke Show, they started to repeat themselves a little bit with stuff that they had done in season 1. They modified it. CBS wanted the show in color the 5th season, because about 35% of their schedule was in color that season. And Carl said no, because he knew the rerun value of the show. And he didn't want one season of the show standing out, looking weird. So they opted to stay in black and white, as did 60% of the shows that were on CBS that season. He also knew that they would not go to a 6th year, and that would have forced the show to go in color, because everything had gone color in the September of 1966. People on the show, including critics, said they probably could have got 3 more years out of the Van Dyke Show had it continued. So there would have been 3 years that would have had to be forced to be done in color. And what you would have ended up with is something similar to the Andy Griffith Show. People think the Andy Griffith Show is actually 2 different series. Don Knotts left that show after the 5th year, and then those last 3 seasons of the Andy Griffith Show, they brought in Goober and Howard Sprague and some of these other characters, Paul Hartman as Emmett, the fixer, and it wasn't the same show. So even though it was the same show and it ran on Monday nights for all of those years, the diehards think it's 2 separate shows and that probably would have happened with the Van Dyke Show. Maybe not. But people tend to take the color episodes of a show that started in black and white and consider them inferior to the original black and white shows, with Andy Griffith being a prime example. Bewitched is another example. The charm and the sophistication of Bewitched started to get lost in its first year in color, its third season. It started to become Endora and the Spell of the Week. And, by the time Dick York had left the show had really turned to pretty much dreck. And it wasn't Dick Sargent's fault. You talk about a show that started repeating itself.
Oh, well,
good God,
yeah.
in those last few years, they just reshot shows they shot during the first and second season with Dick Sargent playing Darren.
Yeah, we covered Bewitched on the last show, but you're right.
Right. But my point in all of this is that Carl had the right idea to end the show after 5 seasons. Looking back, I was a kid when the show was on, and I loved the show. I loved it for different reasons back then than I do as an adult. I loved it because of Richie, and I could identify with Richie in the show because he was only a year older than me. But looking back, it's like, yeah, I would have liked to have seen the show continue, but Carl was absolutely right in ending it after 5 seasons because it would have been compared to stuff like the Andy Griffith Show and Bewitched later on. And instead, we've got these 158 shows, which occasionally missed. There are a few shows that weren't that good, but most of them hit it out of the park. And to this day, it's one of the most brilliantly written, brilliantly acted, sophisticated sitcoms of the 1960s, in my opinion.
So when that show ended, then he went to work on Chitty Chitty Bang Bang?
Well, that wasn't the first film, but that's the reason he left, was his manager, Byron Paul, had gotten him a movie contract where he would do at least one movie a year. And so that was set, and the movies were shooting all, different parts of the year, so he couldn't commit to a series at that point. And Mary had the same deal. And Dick had his share of hits and misses in the movies. Mary's career flopped, though, in the movies, and she tried Broadway, and that didn't go over so well. Both of them ended up returning to television in some form or another. Mary first, of course, with the Mary Tyler Moore Show, which is as big a hit or bigger than the Dick Van Dyke Show. So she did quite well. After that, though, she couldn't retain the magic that she had from both of the other series, and she was quite upset by that too. Dick, of course, had the new Dick Van Dyke Show, and his big problem was Mary Tyler Moore was replaced by Hope Lang, and Hope was a nervous wreck because she had never done audience shows before. And he shot that show the way he shot the Van Dyke Show, and the general public was kind of upset too that she was playing his wife and Mary wasn't. And neither of them had this, after Mary's series, neither of them had the incredible success they had from the first series again, but they both did quite well. Dick continued. Dick did a variety show, and he did some movies, and then, of course, Diagnosis Murder put him back on the map. And it was a different type of a show, and people forget that even though it doesn't have the staying power that the Van Dyke Show in the 60s had, that show ran about 4 or 5 seasons longer than the Van Dyke Show ran. And that show had far more longevity during its day when it ran the first time, and Dick made a hell of a lot more money on that show than he had made in the Van Dyke Show. The thing is that even though Diagnosis Murder is in reruns now, you can see it on MeTV and the DVDs have been put out, it doesn't have the love and affection from the audience that the Van Dyke Show had.
What was the movie that Mary Tyler Moore did with Elvis?
Oh, was that Change of Habit?
Yes. Yeah, that's the one.
That almost killed her career altogether.
God, what a terrible movie that was.
Yeah.
It was awful.
Yeah. And she, like Dick, thought she was going to become a big movie star. And like I said, Dick had his ups and downs. He had a couple of good movies. The Comic, which was very underrated at the time that it came out, is on my top 10 list of best movies. Dick is wonderful in that movie. He's brilliant. And Carl Reiner directed that and co-wrote it with Aaron Rubin. How could you go wrong? The problem was it came out in the late 60s, and the Vietnam War and the culture of our country was hippie, and it was just the wrong time for that film. And if you recall, it was around 1971 or 72 when the Marx Brothers and the Three Stooges, and to a certain extent Laurel and Hardy, kind of had a resurgence with teenagers and college kids. and all of that stuff became popular again. That's when You Bet Your Life started to resurface in reruns on television. So if the comic had come out 3 years or so after it was released, it probably would have done better. But it is revered now by historians and people like me who love Dick Van Dyke. I think it's one of his best films. I put it right up there with Mary Poppins. Dick was robbed of an Oscar for Mary Poppins, in my opinion, by the way.
I think so, except he did get criticized for his Cockney accent.
You know what's weird about that is I didn't notice it at the time. Of course, I was 8 when Mary Poppins came out, but I knew who Dick was, and I valued his talent. I didn't notice it, you know. It seemed to me it started about 20 years ago. All of a sudden, everybody criticized his accent. Now, I had Karen Dautrice on my show. Karen played Jane Banks, right?
Oh,
and
okay.
I asked Karen, I said, was it really bad when you guys were shooting? And she said on my show, it was bloody awful. And I said, okay, as a kid, you noticed it was bloody awful. But you're surrounded. He's surrounded by you and David Tomlinson and Matthew Garber and Hermione Baddeley and all of these and Arthur Treacher and all of these and Glynis Johns, all of these British actors. Why didn't any of you pull him aside while you were filming and say, Dick, you got to work on your accent? And her answer was, come on now, Stu. You know, when you're British, you're proper and you have manners and you keep your thoughts to yourself.
Right, and plus he was an American.
I forgot about Julie Andrews, the star of the film. She was British. So anyway, he was trained by J. Pat O'Malley, one of the greatest character actors, you know, the world has ever seen. And J. Pat O'Malley was Irish.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
So he was taught, his accent is somewhere between British, Liverpool British, and Irish. And Dick likes saying, you know, that he was using an accent that was used in a very, very, very small part of England, way, way, way up in the northern part, where people did talk just like him. And I said to him, I said, you know, I've seen that film 50 times. It's one of my favorite films. And I don't think your accent is bad at all. And he said, thanks, Stu. And I said, then again, you're talking to a Jewish kid from the San Fernando Valley, so what the hell do I know? And he laughed, you know. So
well, you know, every time I've seen that, it wouldn't have mattered if he had just done it as an American. He could have just been this weird American guy that was hanging around in the park with his one-man band suit. He could have been, but that's not the way that P.L. Travers, which is a story in itself, how she wrote the book. The one thing that did make him feel better was when Mary Poppins Returns came out 5 or 6, 7 years ago, whenever it was, and Lin-Manuel Miranda kind of took over his part, even though it wasn't the same part. Lin-Manuel Miranda's accent wasn't great either, and that's not to slam him. It's just Dick felt a hell of a lot better when that movie came out. And Dick made a cameo in that, as you know, at the end, which was the best part of the film as far as I'm concerned, but I'm a little bit partial. So, well, the Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, which came out a few years later, was filmed, or it was supposed to take place in England, but right. he didn't use an accent at all in that.
Right. And the story there was that Cubby Broccoli, who produced the film, said, I want you to use, I want you to do a British accent again for this film. And Dick said, you're kidding, right? You saw Mary Poppins, right? And Cubby said, yeah, that's why I want you to use it. He said, either you're deaf or you have no business producing this film. So they compromised. Actually, they didn't compromise. Dick won that argument, and Dick used his own voice in that, and it worked.
It worked fine. It worked fine.
Of course, Cubby Broccoli thought that was going to be the next Mary Poppins, with the Sherman Brothers writing the music and all that, and it did okay, but it didn't do anywhere near Mary Poppins. The film is all right. It just didn't have the magic that Mary Poppins had. It didn't have the Disney touch. Cubby Broccoli was not Walt Disney.
Was he related to Albert, the one who did all the James Bonds?
Yeah, because Cubby produced all of those too.
Oh, maybe that's his nickname then.
Maybe that's his real name. Yeah,
Okay.
Albert Broccoli. Cubby was a nickname. No, I'm not into movies the way I'm into classic TV. But yeah, no, Cubby Broccoli did all the James Bond movies. So that Albert is probably his real name. I just learned something from you. There we go.
So it was an interesting time. You mentioned the Vietnam War and the late 60s and things were changing. Chitty Chitty Bang Bang came out in 68, I believe?
Yes, correct.
Okay, and that year, the film of the year was Oliver, which got 5 or 6 Academy Awards and 11 nominations. And the landscape of television was changing, or was soon to change, because I think people were getting...
It was changing.
Yeah.
Let me give you a couple of monumental things. It changed. I know what you're leading up to, but let me just tell you that 1968, Diane Carroll was given her own show, Julia. So that was the first black actress to play the lead in a sitcom where she wasn't a maid or a butler.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
All right. Clarence Williams became the co-star of the Mod Squad, and the Mod Squad itself was about 3 former hippies who became cops. That had a long run. There were 1 or 2 other monumental things that happened in the late 60s that kind of were the foundation for what you're leading up to, which we can now get into. Well, so I just wanted to get those on record, okay?
The other show I was thinking about while you were saying that was I Spy. Wasn't that in there too?
Yes, I Spy actually is a very good point. That started in 65, and that gave Bill Cosby a co-starring role in an hour-long dramatic show. So yeah, technically that was really the start of it, although it would be a couple of years before the other 2 shows I mentioned would really get the ball rolling and starting to see a change in TV. And it was very gradual, because you still had Bewitched, and you still had Beverly Hillbillies, and you still had Green Acres. And as Pat Buttram said, you had all these shows with trees in them. That's his famous line was, when television changed in the 70s, the CBS canceled any show with a tree. I almost sound like Pat Buttram. He canceled any show with a tree in it, like Petticoat Junction. That was part of it. They also got rid of Red Skelton and Ed Sullivan and all of these variety shows that have been on since the early days of television.
That's true.
Now you may proceed now on your own show, Douglas. Go ahead.
Well, the reason I mentioned I Spy too is to give a plug to Joseph Culp, who was on my show. He's the son of Robert Culp, who was the co-star in that.
Yes.
And Joseph is now a fairly successful film producer and actor, and also doing stage work. And we had a nice interview.
Good.
And so
Glad
it was
to hear that.
fun to talk to him. So I was just sort of leading to the big change in TV, and one of the shows that was certainly instrumental in completely changing the landscape of television was All in the Family. All of a sudden now, you could, although I don't know if they ever showed the toilet, they certainly used the sound effect of the toilet.
Yes.
But there was that...
that wasn't the only thing that changed television, the sound of a toilet. But it was integrated into the rest of the show, which did.
Right. And just the fact that they talked about current events, about racism, they talked about women's lib, they talked about all these things that none of the other shows pretty much dared to talk about.
Issues.
Yeah, current events and issues. And it was quite revolutionary. And I think after that show, we were mentioning in the break there, which didn't come on the air, but we were talking about Family Affair, and those kind of shows just sort of weren't interesting to people anymore because they've gone another step. Television had stepped up to... Remember,
though, that there were a couple of shows that survived that. The Brady Bunch and the Partridge Family. They survived that, at least
My
until
Three
the
Sons,
70s.
maybe.
My Three Sons died in 1972, so it was right around the purge. When Norman Lear sort of took over television in 1971, or at least CBS, All in the Family begot Maude, which begot Good Times. All in the Family begat the Jeffersons.
Right.
By the mid-'70s, the other networks had jumped on the bandwagon too. Sanford and Son became a massive hit, and Chico and the Man on NBC. Sanford and Son was part of Norman Lear's company. ABC kind of went in a different direction. They tried the prejudice and the issues bit. They weren't as successful because they had the younger demos. And they always had the younger demos. Even in the 60s, when CBS had the top 10 shows on the air sitcom-wise, their shows were never in the top 10, but they had Ozzie and Harriet and Donna Reed and Leave It to Beaver and the Flintstones and stuff like that. And even though they were not top 10 shows, they had the younger demographics. So ABC went into a different direction. When Fred Silverman left CBS to try to work his magic on ABC, the prejudice stuff and the issue stuff didn't work, but the TNA and the stupid stuff did. Happy Days, Laverne and Shirley, Three's Company. That was the direction that ABC took. He took advantage of the demos ABC had and dumbed down that network, with Welcome Back, Kotter and other stuff like that, because the demos were there. And the demos absorbed that stuff the way the older demos absorbed the issue-oriented shows. And that's how television changed during the 70s. In two different directions. And NBC, that was the start of the end for them until The Cosby Show and Cheers and Family Ties brought them back in the 80s. If you look at the trends, it's fascinating to see how television changed so much and how everything kind of zigzagged back and forth to where by the 90s, NBC was the most respected network. CBS was a close second, but CBS always skewed old. They had great shows, but they had no massive viewers under the age of 55.
That's
I know
interesting.
we're getting off topic here, so again, where did you want to go with this exactly?
Well, I just wanted to...
I could talk for hours, and I have. So.
I just wanted to... What did you do exactly on All in the Family? I know you worked on the show. What was your function?
My function was to book the studio audiences. I was just out of high school and into college, and it was a low entry job into the business to hand out tickets to the shows to fill the seats. Now, for the Norman Lear shows that were established, that was quite easy. All in the Family and Maude and Good Times and the Jeffersons, we very rarely had empty seats, but he was in development trying to get more of the same type of shows on the air and trying to strike gold, with other shows that weren't as successful and were super hard to fill. And we could do a show on that in the future if you want, on how to get audiences to come to these things. I'm sure All in the Family, before it got on the air, was super, super hard to fill because of the subject matter. Nobody had seen that kind of stuff discussed on television before, especially in a sitcom, and people were probably offended by it until Archie became this, lovable bigot. Yeah, he was a jerk and he was wrong about everything, but he was still lovable. And the way that came together was pretty fascinating. Now, I didn't work on All in the Family until it was an established hit. And the only reason I ended up working on it was because CBS ran out of room for Norman Lear. He was creating shows right and left for all the networks. And CBS didn't have the capacity to shoot the shows, so he was looking for an independent studio to put all of his shows under one roof. He had just sold One Day at a Time for CBS as well, and they didn't have the room for him there. So he looked at Metromedia Square, which is where I worked, and at the time it was home to Truth or Consequences with Bob Barker and Concentration with Jack Nars. Two real biggies, But they had all these empty studios there because both of those shows only took up one stage. And Lear figured out a way that he could bring all of his shows over there, utilize all of the stages, and not have to go from network to network and do all of his shows there. So we were fortunate to have all of these, classy, sophisticated, dignified programming come into the little lot where I was working, and it was like we went from the bargain basement at Walmart to Tiffany's overnight. They redid. They spent millions of dollars refurbishing all the studios. They put in new bleachers. They like I said, they spent millions of dollars because Lear signed like a 5-year deal. I think it was six years. They left in '82, came in '75. It was a 7-year deal. So it was worth it for Metro Media to pump all this money in. They made it all back in a couple of seasons because Lear kept selling shows. And like I said, I got into that studio because it was an easy studio to get into. It wasn't a big studio, and there were jobs available, and that's how I broke into the business. And so it was timing. Just like everything else in my career was timing. Getting into audience warm-ups was timing. I got into that place booking these 2 little syndicated game shows and ended up working on some of the biggest shows in television. And again, that's a long answer to your short question. What I did was I booked the audiences for those shows after they were massive hits.
I don't want to start dissecting episodes of All in the Family too much, but were you there for the Sammy Davis Jr. one, or which season was that?
No, that was season 2, and that was at CBS.
Oh, okay.
But I was there for the Edith rape show in season 8.
Oh, I remember that one. Yeah, that was a drag. That was a real depressing show.
Yeah, I'll give you some background on it very quickly.
Okay.
That was only supposed to be a 30-minute self-contained show. And if you recall the episode, they're all next door preparing for her 50th birthday, and she's baking her own cake. And she gets a knock on the door from a guy, supposedly a salesman, who turns out to be a rapist in the neighborhood. And for the 3/4 of the episode, he tries his best to rape her. And the cake is burning. The audience, by the way, is in shock through this whole thing. They're politely laughing at some of the jokes in there because of the subject matter. Nobody that came to that, and we used to shoot the show twice. We'd do a dress rehearsal show. They called it a dress at 5:30, and then what they called the air show at 8 o'clock. But if the 5:30 audience and the acting was better, that would be the master tape they would use, which would go on the air. That's the reason they would shoot it twice. They would edit the best parts of both together for what the audiences at home would see. So the audience at 5:30 was pretty silent once they got into this thing. There wasn't a hell of a lot to laugh at in this scene where he's chasing her around the living room trying to undress her and everything. It was pretty heavy-duty stuff. She made a couple of jokes. The audience kind of politely, embarrassingly, nervously laughed because they were really into the show. But the climax of the show, where she runs into the kitchen to check that the cake is burning, and she picks up that cake and smashes it into his face, burning it, and he runs out of the back door screaming, I have never seen an audience go so incredibly wild in my life. They were on their feet, some of them. Some of them were stomping their feet on the floor and clapping and cheering. It probably broke the microphones hanging above their heads. I was standing in the back of the bleachers, and even I was cheering because I hadn't seen the show until they did it for the first audience. Anyway, the end of that show, she goes running next door to Archie, and it kind of ends with her sobbing in his arms. And that's the end of the show. And that was going to be the end of the show, but because the audience response was nothing like they thought it was going to be in the control room, Norman Lear himself came out after the show, after he introduced David Dukes, who was a terrific actor who played the part of the rapist. He wouldn't let the audience leave. He wanted some feedback. He said, this was going to be it. Now, are you guys all satisfied? And the audience, which was about 90% women, because the men were still working at 5:30 in the afternoon when we shot this show, 90% of the women said, you can't end the show this way. There has to be some resolution. There has to be a finish. We have to know what happened to Edith afterwards. Did she cooperate with the police? Did she turn the guy in? There has to be a button on this. And he did the same thing at the 8 o'clock show. I wasn't at the 8 o'clock show, but apparently the audience response was as good or even better. So they decided then and that night that they had to write a second half to that show. And they had 3 other shows they were working on at the time, and they went ahead and shot those over the next couple weeks, and then came back and revisited this and shot this 2 or 3 weeks later because they needed time to work on the script. And they aired the 2 of them back to back as an hour show on CBS during the November sweeps. And I'm telling you, I have been to, I worked for Lucille Ball. I know Dick Van Dyke. I have been to a lot of historical events in my 66 years on this planet, of almost 50 years of working in television. That was one of the most exciting nights I've ever had just watching that episode in person and watching the response of that audience. It was pretty heavy duty stuff. And that was so late in the show's run, the 8th year. They had a lot of good shows that 8th year because that was the year that they thought that the show was going to end. That was the year that Rob Reiner and Sally Struthers' a contract was up. And they left the show at the end of that season. So they wanted to make sure that, the episode, that's the year that Archie bought Kelsey's bar and he had a drug problem. And they went into all of these things that you'd never think that the Bunkers would ever encounter. And I think the 8th season of the show is probably right up there with the first 3 or 4 seasons of the show, particularly that episode. Now, a lot of people came away from that episode not liking it. How dare they do that to Edith and blah, 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 blah. But again, you're going to get different opinions. For me, it was one of the most powerful things I'd ever seen in all of the years I worked in television. Again, a long answer, but I hope it answered your question.
Well, we had talked about in the last show, we had talked about Bewitched and how they should have cut it off after season 5 because it just got stale. But All in the Family, you don't think that happened with it once?
It happened. It definitely happened.
Yeah.
It happened right after that season. Right after Rob and Sally left the show, CBS negotiated with them to do a 9th season, and Carol was tired of doing the show in front of an audience. He did not want to do this. He hated the grind of reading on Monday, shooting on Friday till 2 a.m, doing pickups. And because Rob and Sally were gone, and because CBS basically backed up the Brinks truck to them and said, "We'll pay you whatever you want, just give us another year," they were all kinds of acquiescences, if that's a word, to keep that show on the air. So that was the year they brought in, and I don't blame her because it wasn't her fault. They brought in Danielle Brisebois as the orphan,
the little girl, yeah.
Shot the show to hell. That whole season without the live audience there, and bringing in a kid, which is the jumping the shark for every sitcom you can think of. When the kids in the show get to be too old, they bring in younger kids. It happened with Dennis the Menace. It happened with My Three Sons. I mean, you can name 100 shows. It happened with the Brady Bunch, which wasn't a spectacular program to begin with, but whenever they bring in kids, you can just kiss that show goodbye. And bringing in that kid to All in the Family softened Archie, for one thing. Without Rob and Sally there, just making guest appearances, there was no more conflict. Right. And the audiences were not there to give them the reaction that they need or the energy they needed. What they would do at that point is they would shoot the show over 2 days. They would shoot Act 1 on Thursday. They would shoot Act 2 on Friday. When it was edited together, they would take the tape over to the One Day at a Time show that was shot on Fridays. And after they shot One Day at a Time's dress show at 5:30 in front of an audience, they would ask them to stay, and they would play back the previous week's All in the Family show, which was all edited, so that they could add the laughs to the show and have it sound sort of spontaneous. The problem was sometimes the audience over-responded and the actors didn't allow for that extra time like they would have if they were in front of an audience, and the audience would laugh over the next few lines of dialogue, and they had to bring the audience levels down so that you could hear the actors talk. It was just a mess. Just a mess. And of course, after that, CBS negotiated with Carol to do Archie Bunker's Place and keep the show going, okay? And it just got worse and worse. Jean Stapleton did 5 of those. She was tired and she wanted to move on. You can only make so many millions of dollars and play the same thing over and over again until it gets mundane and monotonous. And Jean Stapleton wanted to move on. She wanted to go back to doing movies and doing stage work, which was her first love. And she had made enough money, so she ends up getting killed off so Archie could date other women. And then, Danielle Brisebois still in the show. They brought in another teenage girl to live with Archie. Now, think about this. This is Archie, who's like my age now, in his late 60s, with 2 teenage girls living there and running the bar. And it went back to CBS because Carol O'Connor hated Metro Media from the day he set foot on the place, couldn't stand it. And the lighting on the show changed. I don't know if you noticed this. It got very dark. The lighting in the bunker house got very dark and depressing, and they totally sweetened the show like they would a single camera film show in those last few years. There was no more even playing back the tape to a live audience. it just became a dull, dark, unfunny, horribly written, horribly acted, and it's hard for me to say that with Carol O'Connor, show that should have gone off when Rob and Sally left the show. So yes, it went on, and it was worse than the last 2 years of Bewitched.
Well, I'm glad
I put Three's Company, which is a horrible, awful, terrible, stupid show, a notch above Archie Bunker's place in my list of I won't say it on your show. Let's just say crappy sitcoms. Okay.
Well, if
got me all worked up here, Douglas.
Well, if you think that it was actually worse than Three's Company, that's pretty bad, because that had to be one of the worst shows on.
Than Welcome Back, Kotter. But let me make this clear, that Welcome Back, Kotter and Three's Company and Archie Bunker's Place are still at the bottom of my all-time sitcom, the bottom being the worst from top to bottom. They would be at the top of my all-time worst sitcom. I think My Mother the Car is better than Archie Bunker's Place.
Well, it's funny because you had some great people in those shows. I mean, Carol O'Connor, certainly. But with Three's Company, John Ritter, I mean, an incredible talent.
John Ritter was the whole reason Three's Company was a success.
Yeah.
The problem with Three's Company was you never knew who was going to be dumb from week to week. Now, Chrissy was the overall dumb one, but there were shows where Jack was dumb.
Yeah.
There were shows when Janet was dumb. There were shows when Richard Klein was dumb. There were shows when Norman Fell was dumb. And then the next week, he's the voice of reason. It was just so stupid. It was just stupid. And because of that, because the producers didn't decide who was going to be the dumb one from week to week, some of the writers on the show quit because they couldn't stand it. They'd write a script, and the producers would say, no, Janet's the dumb one this time. And they'd have to go back and rewrite it. It was the most disjointed, and the premises were stolen from every other sitcom you could think of. Wasn't there a show where Jack and Janet get handcuffed together? I was waiting for him to sing Babaloo.
Oh, yeah.
It's crazy. Yeah. Just that, and Kotter was just as bad. I mean, this was how Fred Silverman built up ABC. This was the start of the dumbing down of the country, I think, come to think of it. I used to give Chuck Barris credit for that with the Dating Game and the Newlywed Game, but I think it was that plus these ABC shows, and it really got exacerbated in the 90s when you had Jerry Springer and Geraldo Rivera hit the scene. And then, of course, the Kardashians in this century. I mean, you could draw a whole timeline on when the dumbing down of this country started, and it continues to this day. And unfortunately, it's invaded politics now, and it's wrecking our country, but we won't go there.
Well, I think you're right. And unfortunately, it's just gotten worse because now everybody can make a show.
Oh, yeah. Hey, everybody with a webcam and a microphone, any idiot, hello, here I am, can have their own show and do whatever they want and get an audience. Yeah. And that's part of the problem. You don't need to rent a studio. You don't need a satellite dish to beam your show. All you need is an internet connection and a microphone. And that's what you and I are competing with 12-year-olds with makeup tips on YouTube that get thousands of hits. They're called influencers now. I don't know where that came from, but that drives me up the wall, an influencer. Well, I'd like to influence them with my fist.
Well, the interesting point, though, is that even back then in the 70s, when this didn't exist, when the internet didn't exist, you still had incredibly stupid stuff out there.
Yeah,
you know, it wasn't all quality, even though they had the whole NBC at their disposal. You know?
Yeah, Charlie's Angels. I mean, we could go on and on and on about this, the stupid. My step-grandmother used to call them moron TV shows. And that's what they were. They were moron TV shows. And you know, and it's funny. They all got good ratings. They got the same ratings that All in the Family got. You know, there used to be a joke among the writers at All in the Family when I was there is, you know, we were talking about Edith being raped, right? And one of the writers used to joke and say, yeah, and over at the Mary Tyler Moore Show, they're doing a salute to mayonnaise. You know, which is a funny joke, and it's not true. But I mean, the Mary Tyler Moore Show was a family show, and it was a well-written, great show. but it was totally different. But it wasn't a moron show.
No, it wasn't.
Like Three's
No.
or Welcome Back, Kotter.
Because
or,
it had...
Or Laverne and Shirley or Happy Days, you know?
I think the difference was that Mary Tyler Moore Show, number one, had incredible actors, and the characters were well developed, and even though they might not have done anything particularly controversial or, oh my God, she said that, it was just the way that they played with each other and played off of each other.
It's called sophistication.
Yeah, it was so much better. And they had a great setup with the newsroom. It was in a higher class. The writing was a higher class than the other shows.
Yes, and that's the secret. It wasn't stupid. It was it didn't have the controversy or the issues that Norman Lear had. It was sophisticatedly written and acted, and deserved every Emmy it got. Same thing with all of Norman Lear's shows, most of Norman Lear's shows. Look, Mary Tyler Moore's company had some misses too. Paul Sand and Friends and Lovers, Doc. There were shows that were not good, and then other companies like Screen Gems tried to copy what Norman Lear was doing, like with Bridget Loves Bernie. Remember that show?
I remember the name, but
well, it was about a Jewish guy who married a Catholic girl and the fighting that ensued between the two families because they weren't of the same religion. Okay.
God.
Now, if Norman Lear had done that, it might have survived. But and Ned Glass, who we talked about earlier, was one of the stars of that. So was Audra Lindley before Three's Company. It wasn't it wasn't a stupid dumb show like Three's Company was, but it wasn't well written. I mean, they ran out of ideas after a while. How can you keep that premise up for 24 episodes where it's just the Hatfields and McCoys battling over every week, except over religion instead of whatever it was they were battling over in the hillbilly version.
Well, now speaking of dumb shows, do you remember the Paul Lynde show?
Oh yes. That was unbelievable to begin with. Now, everybody knows Paul Lynde. Everybody knows how flamboyant he was as Uncle Arthur. Everybody had seen him on Hollywood Squares. It was no secret who he was. Everybody loved him. So they're giving him a wife and kids and a son-in-law? Is that believable? Is that believable? Again, one season.
Yeah, and that was the reason that it went one season, is people went, oh, come on. You expect us to buy that?
There was chemistry between him and Elizabeth Allen, too. There was a lot of turmoil behind the scenes on that show. But that was William Asher's attempt at trying to get back into a long-running sitcom after Bewitched. He had just divorced Elizabeth Montgomery, and he wanted to keep his legacy going. And then he tried Temperatures Rising after that with Cleavon Little. That got a season and a half, but they had to make massive cast changes to that. TV was changing, and Asher's style of comedy was not
kind of
welcome.
On the way out. Yeah. Well, it's too bad because Paul Lynde was such a great talent, but he was about 20 years ahead of his time because he couldn't really be openly gay in those, in those days. There was just no way. No. They didn't do gay characters.
No, but to make him a husband, I mean, and have kids and a family, and
incredibly unbelievable.
Yeah.
Let me just wrap up with All in the Family here. So, did you have any encounters with Carol O'Connor and Jean Stapleton?
Jean Stapleton was one of the sweetest, nicest ladies I've ever met. I'm friends with her son John, who was an actor as a teen and as a college age, and then became one of the top sitcom directors and now film directors. John and his wife were just here about a year ago, right after I moved up here, because they had some film they needed transferred. They came up and spent the day. Jean Stapleton, when she spoke to you, her eyes locked on yours. Nothing distracted her. When she talked to you, she focused on you. One of the sweetest, most genuine, and smartest people I have ever met. Just a wonderful, lovely, lovely lady. Carol O'Connor I never got to know well because he was sort of intimidating. I was a little bit afraid of him, his presence. He was a big man. He played that character so well. I never called him Carol. I heard that you don't call him that until he tells you that it's okay to call him. It's kind of like Jackie Gleason. You either call him the Great One or you call him Mr. Gleason. He had people fired for calling him Jackie on the set, from what I understand. Carol O'Connor was the same way. I always called him Mr. O'Connor. He was a very serious, quiet, not shy, just quiet, sort of the opposite of Archie Bunker. Sometimes when he talked to you, it sounded like he was mumbling. You couldn't hear what he said. I stayed at a distance. He knew I was a big fan. He always liked the fact that I was in the audience for those playback shows at One Day at a Time because he liked my laugh. It was just magic being around him, but it was very intimidating. And sometimes when you'd say hello to him, he would answer you back. Sometimes he wouldn't. Like I said, I kept my distance. I never got real close to him. I knew Sally, probably the best of the four of them. Sally was really sweet and nice. I did warm up on her spinoff on her Gloria show. She was always nice to me, always up and bubbly. And Rob was sort of like Carol, but nicer and approachable. And I heard he mellowed after that show was over with, and he's pretty much a great guy. A lot of people say he's not as nice as Carl. Carl was wonderful. Carl was a sweet, sincere, wonderful, loved doing my show because he got 2 hours instead of 10 minutes on later incarnations of The Tonight Show, and he'd be the last guest. With me, he got 2 hours, and we talked about editing the Van Dyke Show and stuff that he would never, ever discuss on the other shows. So I had a great rapport with him. But I heard, Rob was a nice guy, but didn't have the warmth and the sincerity that his dad had, which I can vouch for. I didn't get to know Rob real well. It was that was the granddaddy of all the Norman Lear shows, and you kind of kept your distance from all of them. The writers didn't like them. They didn't like the writers. There was constant rewriting right up to taping time. But I did get to know Jean a little bit better after she left All in the Family. I knew her a little bit then. Even then, she was a lovely lady, and afterwards, she was wonderful. So, again, a long answer to your short question.
All right. Well, you know what, Stu? We just blew through an hour, and I think...
Your choice of words is wonderful, Douglas. Thank you.
If you'd like to come back, I really do want to talk about Paul Peterson because I know you had him on your show many, many times. I listened to. Friend. He came every year, right? Yeah.
He did once a year until his health prevented him. Right. And he can't come up here now. He can't come up here now at all because of his health issues.
I know he's having some health issues, and I feel bad about that. But I did want to talk about him and talk about a minor consideration and child actors. I think it's a serious topic. I mean, we've had the whole Michael Jackson thing in our heads for a long time, and there's been others, Corey Feldman. I think it's a big problem in Hollywood. Kids being abused, taken advantage of, and I think it's something that's worth talking about. It's affected a lot of child actors. And
I worked on Diff'rent Strokes, so I can tell you a lot.
Okay. So let's have you back. Thank you again for coming on. Always a pleasure. And on the next episode, we will talk about Paul Peterson and maybe talk about Johnny Whitaker, who you also had on your show, another great child actor who has had his ups and downs, certainly. But I look forward to having you back. Thank you again, Stu.
Always a pleasure to be with you too, Douglas. I like doing your show very much.
Well, thank you. That's great. We love having you here.